Hello, in this lecture I will explain what a single neuron, also known as perceptron, is. At first we will see what the graphical representation of a single neuron looks like. Then we will understand that an artificial neuron corresponds to affine linear.
An artificial neuron, also known as perceptron, is the basic computational unit of artificial neural networks. It is inspired by biological neurons, and you might remember from biology that a biological neuron is a cell that is connected to other neurons via so-called dendrites. And the connection strength depends on these synapses. Then we have a further connection to other neurons, referred to as axion. If such an neuron gets activated by the information sent by connected neurons, the activation somehow integrates and sums up, and if it exceeds a certain threshold, an electrical stimulus is sent via the axion to the next neuron. An artificial neuron now is a very simple model of such a biological neuron. It consists out of input features, shown here in green, which correspond to the connected neurons. So here we have P input features. Then we have connections to the cell F, and each connection has a weight. Here connection input X1 is weighted with W1, which corresponds to the connection strength and the synapses. Then we have a bias term, which is just a scalar and which can be seen as a base activation of the neuron, which is independent from the input. Now everything is fed into this node F as a weighted sum. We see that input 1 is multiplied by weight 1, and so on. Input P by weight P, and we add the bias. And all that is the input of a function tau. This is a so-called activation function. And the output, or the value of that function, given the weighted sum as input, is the output of the neuron. Here we can also write it short as vector multiplication if we write in the vector W all the weights of the connections, and in the vector X all the input values. And a single artificial neuron represents very different kind of functions or models depending on the choice of the activation function tau. If we choose the identity, we end up with simple linear regression. That if tau here is the identity, we just get the product of W and X. If we instead choose tau to be the logistic function, we get logistic regression. As seen by this formula, which should be familiar to you. Let's look at the model of an artificial neuron more closely, step by step. Let us consider a perceptron with a three-dimensional input. This would present such a function. We have three input variables x1, x2, and x3, corresponding to 3 nodes or neurons in the so-called input layer. In general, if we have a p-dimensional input feature x, we would have p input neurons in the input layer. Now we have connections to outgoing from all the input layers, and each of the connection is associated with a weight. W1, W2, and W3. We can also have a bias term, but this is often not visualized. This is just because of a simple trick. To leave it out in the graphical representation, we can just add a constant input feature 1 to the input vector x and a constant or weight corresponding to the bias b to the weight vector. Graphically, that would be, we have a constant input 1 here, and the bias vector on the corresponding connection, the bias value. This is just a trick that allows that in the graphical representation we don't need to draw the bias term as an extra node. So all the connections go to an output called f, and in this output neuron all the computation tau takes place. We can picture the input vector being fed to the neurons on the left, and then the computations being performed from left to right. This is called a forward pass. And then the activation function is applied to this weighted sum, to the input of the output neuron. And this is usually nonlinear, as for example seen with the sigmoid. So the example of the linear activation function is a bit untypical. So a single neuron has these 2 steps, the affine transformation and then the typically nonlinear activation function. Therefore, a single neuron can already solve small tasks like simple linear regression or linear classification. To optimize such a model, we can minimize empirical risk. Recall that the empirical risk is given by the sum over training examples over a loss function, which gets 2 arguments. On the one hand, the network prediction, and on the other hand, the ground truth. In the case of a regression, the loss function is typically the L2 loss, or the squared error, which is just the square difference between the truth, or the true label, and the output of the network. In the case of binary classification, we usually have the cross-entropy loss, also known as Bernoulli loss. For a single neuron and both choices of activation function we discussed, the resulting model or resulting function is convex. That means that we can find a global optima, for example, by iterative algorithms like gradient descent. If you don't know about gradient descent yet, don't worry, because we will learn about it in the lecture. A single neuron with logistic sigmoid function as activation function and trained with a Bernoulli loss yields the same results as logistic regression when we train it until convergence. That's not surprising because we already noted that both correspond to the same hypothesis class and therefore to the same model. In the case of the L2 loss and regression, we know that we can find the optimal solution by solving normal equations. Note, however, that this is like such an analytical solution is not always or is usually not available, especially if we have more complex models than just that given by a single neuron. And for such more complex models like complete neural networks, we cannot find the optimal solution analytically. Therefore, we will need to use other optimization strategies, as we will see in later chapters of this lecture.